tough waters that startups usually have. We hear about stories like Alibaba, Google, and others that everybody thinks that when we see those stories, we think they all went straight up in one direction. And the management teams tend to be really a mix of capabilities. This is why we look for a team, because it's hard to find these in any one person. So you look for a visionary, you look for somebody who can execute the business plan, you look for somebody who's optimistic and persistent, but you also look for the same person to be able to listen to the market and adapt the business. And which is why you look for teams, because you can't find any one person who can encapsulate all that. So in a nutshell, that's what we look for: innovation, scale, management teams.
What about you, Amin?
I think apart from, scale is probably one of the biggest differentiators between a startup and a large-scale corporation. I think the way tech startups think about scale is dramatically different from how the likes of Walmart have thought so far about it. And I think that's one of the biggest indicators of tech startup mentality that we look for. The other area that's very important to us is who are these tech startups disintermediating, or which demand are they bringing online? So you got to be either disrupting a very a billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar industry, or you got to bring a multi-billion-dollar industry or create a multi-billion-dollar industry, and that's pretty important to be a tech startup.
Oh, that's interesting. So either you're disrupting an existing industry, you're shaking it up, or you are literally creating demand.
Absolutely.
And you're finding a new market. That's interesting.
And this is really important, because that's an important point, because when people think innovation, they usually think invention.
Yes. Yeah.
And there are two different things. If you take Apple's success with the smartphone, they were not the first company to design a smartphone, but they innovated on the smartphone and what it was capable of doing in a consumer's hands. And that captured everyone's imagination. The same thing is true with Alibaba. I mean, they were not the first e-commerce company on the planet. In fact, Jack Ma often says that he went to the US and saw the big players and was inspired to do something similar in China. And so it's a question of how do you innovate over an existing model that makes it much more valuable for your consumers, for your investors, and of course for your employees.
When somebody comes into your office and they're going to make a pitch, and in my head I'm thinking Dragon's Den, when they come in and say, oh, I've got this great idea for a web company, what is the biggest mistake that people make in these pitches?
So I think the fundamental problem that we typically see in the tech industry about ideation is that typically they have a lack of data.
Ironic, actually.
Yeah, it is. And we in a given year probably look at 1,000 to 2,000 startups, and end up investing in maybe 5 to 10 startups. And the reality is that maybe 2 or 3 of them will eventually become billion-dollar companies, like the Alibabas of the world. That's how how stacked up the odds are against you. But I think where fundamentally I see those 1,000 or 992 startups go wrong is lack of data. Is when you are trying to build a business, you have to have customer information. You need to have market information. You need to have information about how you're gonna run the 100-mile journey. And I think that's where fundamentally I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs fail.
Deepak, what about you? What's the biggest mistake you've seen in pitches?
Well, typically it's an entrepreneur who underestimates what it takes to enter a market. I think that very often entrepreneurs come in. Of course, they're bushy-tailed and bright-eyed. They have kept awake all night and weeks writing the business plan, and so they tend to minimize what it takes to enter a new market. And that is that is the biggest issue that I see often. And I spend more time not asking them how they get to $1 billion in revenue, but how do they get that first $1 million in revenue? Because if they can articulate that to me clearly, and I can see what kind of cookies they're going to sell to get to the first million, I know how many of those cookies exist, and I can project how big this company can be.
So Linda, if you can see, the challenge in our profession is the irony in that we are looking for people who are going to disrupt industries, but it's very, very hard to find people who can disrupt industries. So how do you pick one where they haven't even touched their industry?
Well, yeah. So how do you? How do you sift and just pick that sort of a handful? What's a recent example of one that you thought these are the traits that work?
I just closed an investment in New Zealand in a company called Performance Labs. This is a company that was founded by a coach of Olympic teams in New Zealand, and his wife, who's also a 3-time world champion in karate. And they have been working on a coaching business, coaching other world-class athletes for many, many years. And somewhere between 5 and 10 years ago, when smartphones became ubiquitous and people started carrying gadgets on themselves, they realized that all the intellectual property they had, which they used to coach athletes, could now be encapsulated in software, which could travel with the athlete. Instead of them having to stand by them and use their stop clocks, now the athlete could coach himself or herself. And now with big data and analytics, they can capture everything about that athlete through sensors, right? And so they have transformed the company into a technology company that will go with health and fitness wearables. So now you put your wearable on, and you're running, and it will coach you. It will say, oh, by the way, you need to run a little bit faster if you want to hit your goal of finishing this in X amount of time.
Amit, what about you? I mean, when you're trying to sift down these possible investments, what would make the difference between, a couple of companies, say, both in wearable tech, very similar areas, but, what tends to push you over and say, okay, this one I'm going to be putting my money behind?
We internally have created various parameters that we sort of look for a team against. It's the team quality, it's the traction in the market, and that they have a product, are they selling the product already, do they have the right partnerships, and so on and so forth, which all other investors will also look at. But I think that one thing that we sort of almost always use, and it's always worked for us, is that when we've made up our mind about the team, we actually go back and sleep over it. And we see if for the next few days, every morning we wake up more excited about that idea, every morning we wake up more excited about that team, and the mission, the vision that this team is after, that's the one that we feel is always worked for us. You have to have the positive energy. Every morning you wake up and you think, how am I going to enable this entrepreneur to get to the mission, the big bad vision that he has? And that sort of has become, very, I would say, a secret sauce, which is no longer secret for us in terms of taking teams, constitute teams.
Both of you have discussed sort of it's important to see where the company is actually headed. So once they move beyond the startup phase, are you still involved in the company? What are the kind of big challenges once they get to, you pick the right one that hits scale? What are the kinds